In this video, we're going to look at the Rails application folder structure that gets generated when you issue the Rails application name command. So in this case, I've actually created this cookbook application already so we can dig around and look at it here. And you'll see a number of folders inside here. The first one at the top is our app folder. And this is actually where our application files reside, where our controllers files reside, which are .rb files. These are Ruby language files. We have helper files, which are helper methods that our controllers can use inside of, say, our views, that type of thing. We have our models, which are our database models. And we have our views, which inside views we have a couple of folders. We have our layouts. So a layout is a generic RHTML file that a particular controller can spread across all of its views so that you can have a generalized layout that gets spread across several different views. I'll skip that My Test folder for the moment. And finally, we have a particular controller view folder. So each controller will have a view folder of its own. We have a components folder, which is reusable components that your entire application can have access to, and in later videos we'll cover that. You have a configuration folder, which contains files for the configuration of your Rails application. The primary two files that you'll be looking at is your database configuration. The database.yml file tells your Rails application what database server and what database that the application has access to. Environment has different environmental variables such as what CGI processor to use, web server, that type of thing. The routes.rb sets up the actual URLs that show up in the browser, so you can customize those. You're not stuck with the URLs that Rails generates by default, and use that routes.rb to modify that. This is a file created by my text editor. The .db is used if you want to store schema information about your database, such as MySQL dump files, that type of thing can be stored in there. The doc file is where you store your documents, your documentation that you can auto-generate about your application. So you can generate an API document, which would be like HTML showing all your different classes and methods. The LIB is various shared code among the application. The log directory is where various log files are stored. And you can see there's different logs for development versus production. And that's the kind of thing you would set in your environment.rb file, is whether you're in development mode or production mode. You also have a server log, which is the WebRick server. And finally, a test log when you're running tests. Public is very important because that is where the Ruby on Rails files get stored. This is where you'd put images, where you'd put static HTML files. This is where they get stored, is in here. Your style sheets go into a subfolder in here. These are auto-generated files when you created the Rails application. The rake file is the build script for documentation and tests, so you can further build those types of things. The script folder, which we'll cover in the next set of videos, is where various scripts used to manage your application, to create new objects for your application, to start the web server. This is where they're stored, is inside the script folder. Your test folder is where all of your tests are stored. The various Ruby files to test your application, the fixtures for your setting up your database into a test state are all stored in here. Your individual unit tests, and you can see that since we had our recipe controller was generated for us, there is already a test set up in here that we can issue and run to test our application. The temp folder is just where the server stores various things, temporarily cached, that type of thing. And our vendor file is where third-party code is stored, plugins, that type of thing. And it's also if you use the Ruby or the Edge Rails development Rails framework, this is where it would store it locally instead of storing it in your main Rails framework library.